Welcome to the Strive, Seek, Find podcast with me, Tom Heaton. A great amount of my initial philosophical reading and reflection has been on aspects of psychological well-being. This has always seemed such an essential part of living a good life, on a par with maintaining good physical health. I've been lucky enough to be blessed with a very positive baseline psychological state, as well as being deeply lucky in my environment throughout my life. A happy home, excellent opportunities, good health. However, every life has its challenges, be these the pressures of a high-intensity job or the fragility of human health. Indeed, one could argue that a life without challenge is not one that we would ever desire, being that it would preclude us undertaking anything that has a risk of failure, including the human necessity that are interpersonal relationships. This is all a long way of saying that it always seemed essential to me for us to be well equipped to deal with the vicissitudes of life in a skillful way so that we can maximise our happiness. The direction of my own interests in this regard have primarily been in two slightly overlapping directions: Buddhism and Stoicism. These were strands of human thought that had kept such ideas pretty much at the core of what they were all about, and they are filled with ideas that I will no doubt revisit regularly here. Now, Buddhism and Stoicism have as many differences as similarities, but one of the greatest insights that they share is that of perspective. They recognise how reality and our perception of it are different things, sometimes profoundly different. Both have much else within their philosophies, but a drive to improve the awareness of this fact is pretty central. Indeed, when you read some of the more quotable writings, it could be difficult to work out which school of thought they are actually coming from. For example, we suffer more often in imagination than reality. All that we are is a result of what we have thought. How does it help to make troubles heavier by bemoaning them? The first and third of these are from the Stoic philosopher Seneca, whilst the second is from the Buddha. They do an excellent job of making one reflect upon the nature of our self-talk. There are other aspects of each tradition that I have found valuable and interesting, but it is these reflections on human psychology that seem the most important. Indeed, many of them are well incorporated into the burgeoning field of mindfulness, albeit with quite a different slant than these original exponents. I have decided to use this episode to focus on one component in particular, the art of stepping back. To me, this is one of the most valuable themes of both practices, and it is interesting to see the different ways in which they go about turning it into an embodied practice. The most obvious implementation is the meditative practices that appear within the different strands of Buddhism. These are practices and ideas that I've explored and experienced, but I am far from being an expert in them. However, a key strand seems to stand out within all of them. They have the goal of delineating our concept of self. We seem to have a natural tendency to bundle up our emotions, thoughts, and bodily sensations into one single homogeneous entity and label this as me. But we are much more complex than this. Whilst it may superficially feel like we are fairly integrated, even a fairly brief inspection of your mind will demonstrate that this to be empirically false, at least at the level of experience. Let's do a few quick experiments on this. Firstly, make sure you don't think of a pink elephant. How did that go? Probably not very well, as it is difficult to control thoughts like that in the negative. Simply hearing about a pink elephant encourages the immediate mental representation of it. The purpose of this very simple example was to demonstrate how exposed our minds are to external interaction. We sometimes get the impression that we are in control of our thoughts, as if we are somehow directing them, but this is clearly nonsense. Even a few words of speech from someone around us or text in a book can manipulate our thoughts against any will that we may be trying to exert. And indeed, the entire evolutionary purpose of our minds would seem to be to most optimally interact with our environment. As such, thinking we are fully cognitively isolated doesn't seem valid. We are deeply connected to our world. Secondly, in a moment, try to sit down quietly and close your eyes. After a few seconds pause, I want you to completely clear your mind and not think of anything. Just pause this podcast and try that now. How did that go? I'm almost certain that you immediately started thinking about something, maybe after just a few seconds of blankness. If you're like most people, this may have been on the lines of trying not to think. Alternatively, you may have still been thinking about what you've just been listening to, or whether to keep listening, or even getting caught up thinking about what to make for dinner or what that sound was that you just heard. The point of this experiment is partly again to show how out of control our minds actually are. We seem to have absolutely no capacity to stop our mind from thinking, even if we try. However, perhaps a deeper insight from this is around the origin of all these thoughts. Where did that last thought actually come from? If you spend any time thinking about it, you will get a slightly unnerving appreciation that it actually just came from nowhere. The author of your thoughts is actually not the you that you thought it was, but something a bit less clear. This fact becomes clearer the longer you spend practicing meditation. You start to notice that the concept of me is actually just a lot of thoughts arising fairly freely and without much control. Now, this is not to say I don't have some control. When actively thinking about a subject, there is clearly cohesiveness and order to things, where thoughts follow on from previous thoughts. But this is different from the common sense impression of self. I feel like I'm in control, authoring all my thoughts and directing their flow and progression. But when I inspect what my mind is actually like, this is not the case. I can't actually truly see an author. It feels much more like an orchestra with multiple competing components coming together to form a complementary music of conscious experience. Maybe there is a conductor there somewhere, but he's definitely not contributing to the music. Indeed, he might actually just be an observer. This meditative approach brings some profound lessons. Foremost is to stop trusting our mental state as being effectively representative of us as a person. It is not truly correct to say that we are sad. Instead, we're temporarily feeling a strong emotion that is labelled as sadness, and so on and so on. This has many important applications, especially with negative mental states or negative cognitive patterns in ourselves and others. We're often quick to label such transient and capricious states of mind as being reflective of the whole. I feel emotionally negative, therefore I am a depressed person. That person is displaying anger, therefore he is an angry person. I am thinking negative thoughts about a person, therefore I must be morally deficient. These just don't make logical sense if we see people's minds as they are. We can observe that there is simply a dominant theme that is transiently more prominent, but this has only a small amount to do with the individual. While Stoicism has also described many practical exercises towards a similar goal, I've always felt that their approach has been close to one of cognitive behaviour therapy. What I mean is that, in contrast to the experiential approach with meditation, Stoics try to enable better perceptions through our cognitive realisation of these truths. The quotes earlier are good examples. They beautifully articulate a psychological truth in just a few words. Let's take Seneca from above. How does it help to make troubles heavier by bemoaning them? He notes how common it is for us to become deeply involved with our problems, making ourselves one with them, and losing the perspective that we are actually separate. We wallow and fester in the intensity of our emotions. This is often most palpable in retrospect, when we may struggle to understand the strength of the emotion and thoughts that we were experiencing. Again, this can be a window of insight into the incoherence of a notion of self. You were irrationally emotional, and you were then acutely aware of this irrationality. They were both you, but they almost feel like entirely different individuals. The nature of the Stoic reflections and exercises is to try and bring this 20/20 hindsight into the actual moments when they are needed, to be able to have a simple cognitive pattern that you can fall back upon when you feel outrage at being cut up while driving or spoken to rudely. That you can default to a simple aphorism that cuts through the roiling emotion, or have a behavioural habit that halts an imminent wind-up. I personally find this approach both very difficult and very powerful. Difficult because sometimes you're already too affected to care about engaging in some silly piece of logic, perhaps feeling that the emotional signals are actually a better guide to the current truth. But they are powerful because they do also have the power to suddenly allow you to step outside yourself, to get a sudden shift in perspective, as if watching psychological events unfold rather than being in the maelstrom. And then it can be like an off switch. To summarise, the skill is being able to step back. It is being able to bring the retrospective, third-person eye view to your current self. It is being able to differentiate the states that you constantly move through and recognise that they're not actually you, and that some of them are actually quite counterproductive. Once you have this vantage point, it may be that you'll also have the skill to alter the way that you're going to act. This is at least what the Stoics and Buddhists believe. Perhaps the first challenge is actually being able to identify this perspective that I have given as being true. We are so used to viewing ourselves as a single homogeneous psychic entity that it can be difficult to agree with some of my preceding points. But I think that this is where the practices of Buddhism and Stoicism have their greatest value. They are completely experiential in their claims. You can simply have a go and experience some of the observations being described. There are a few things as persuasive as first-hand experience. So perhaps spend a few more minutes just looking inwards. Close your eyes, do absolutely nothing, and observe. Thank you for listening. To keep up to date and to follow my writings, subscribe to me on Substack, which is striveseekfind.substack.com, or follow me on X at @2striveseekfind.